Okay, can everyone see my screen? I should have just shared it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Cool. All right. This will be a pretty easy lecture. Nice way to end the day, and then hopefully we can finish up a bit before 4 o'clock. And yeah, that'll be all for camp today then, if this ever loads. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about South Asia, specifically India and Pakistan, but then also a bit of China, because I guess they're also involved. And I'm just talking about relationships and then how the heck we got here. Along the way, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. At the end of each slide, I'll just like reserve maybe 10 seconds, which can either be awkward silence or people asking questions, and then we can just have like different, that'll just be like the time for people to ask questions, and then we can adjust as needed. But yeah, this is also a pretty dense presentation just because I think that there's a lot of things to unpack when we talk about this very geopolitically fraught region. You know, when you think about it, India, Pakistan, and China, all of these bordering countries have nuclear weapons. And so if anything goes wrong, you're potentially talking about a nuclear Armageddon. And they've done simulations. If India and Pakistan alone go to war, nuclear war, that's 2 billion people dead. So not exactly pleasant. So first off, we have to talk about the pretext and Britain and its imperialism. So from 1757 to 1947, India was this British colony, their crown and jewel, actually. And through British colonialism, it's estimated that roughly $45 trillion was siphoned out of India by the British Raj. So clearly, Indians weren't happy about this. They didn't like the British. They were viewed as like colonialist and oppressors. And so in 1857, India tried to revolt rather unsuccessfully against the British during this thing known as the Sepoy Rebellion, where a bunch of Indian soldiers were like, nope, we're not allowing the British to take one step further in India, stop with this colonial actions. But they were pretty handily defeated. Despite that fact, though, this marked the unofficial start of a burgeoning independence movement that started to really take off with the start of the 20th century. During this period, too, religious violence became a larger cleavage, so like a division in India, because lots of questions erupted over the role of religion in a hypothetically independent Indian state. Many Muslims feared living under a Hindu majority state, while other Indians feared that Muslims wanted to break up the country. And so we really start to see religious violence take a greater role in India during this time period. Okay, so this all culminated in this tense standoff in Calcutta, known as what is now called the Direct Action Day of 1946, or sometimes called the Calcutta riots. And during this, 4,000 Hindus died and 100,000 people in total were evacuated within 72 hours. While this case was an example of Muslim on Hindu violence, there's also lots of examples in the opposite direction where we saw, in some extreme cases, rape and pillage of Muslims. So pretty crazy stuff. And so with all that religious violence on the rise, politicians like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who is the head of the Muslim League, one of India's big political parties, talked about having a separate Muslim state if the British were to ever leave. And India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, reluctantly agreed. And Gandhi, viewed as like the independence leader of India, opposed it, but it was too late. So in 1947, India officially got their wish. They were granted independence 1 year ahead of schedule for what the British had promised. That's because of a mix of the aforementioned independence movement that took place in India, religious tensions between Hindus, Muslims, and then also smaller sects like Sikhs and Jains, and Christians that the British didn't want to deal with. Clement Attlee, who's the leader of the left-leaning Labour Party, who had a dominant defeat over Churchill's party, the Conservative Party, in 1945, which shifted, I guess, like the political dynamic within the United Kingdom and changed its aspirations. And then finally, the financial drain of World War II, all of which caused Britain to move out of India. So yeah, 1947, India finally gets their wish. They become this independent nation once again. But things were a little bit uncomfy. So in the plan to, I guess, move out of India, the British agreed that they were going to divide up India. So you were going to have India remain the country. It was supposed to be this secular state called India, and then a Muslim state called Pakistan. There's the western part of Pakistan, which is the current country, and then the eastern part, which we now know as Bangladesh. But this guy named Cyril Radcliffe, he was this dude. never been east of Paris, and yet for some reason he was tasked up with dividing India into those two states, right? So we have India and Pakistan drawn up by this dude who has absolutely no knowledge of it. And so we had to factor in things like religion, but then also things like railways, irrigation canals, and more. And so Radcliffe was given 36 days to do the job, but actually finished 3 days ahead of schedule. So as a general rule of thumb, if a person who's never been to a country is expected to divide it up into two separate countries and finishes ahead of schedule, chances are things are going to take a total turn for the worse. And so Radcliffe didn't quite finish, though, and didn't draw a really clear line for Kashmir. And so what ends up happening is a total crap show. For reference, this is the region, Jammu and Kashmir, sometimes just called Kashmir. And you can see this is the line of control, which is like, I guess, what separates it. So this part is controlled by Pakistan. This part is controlled by India. And then this part is a boundary claimed by India, but you can see like China's also just taken place in the fun, I guess. So yeah, very fraught area. You have 3 nuclear powers all facing each other in this like geopolitical hotbed. Any questions so far about the Indian independence movement, the messy partition plan, or anything of that sort?
So are places that are claimed by 2 different countries under the de facto control of one of the countries, or are they just sort of chaotic?
It's sort of chaotic. You can sort of think of it like Israel-Palestine almost. So right, about 2/3 of the Kashmiri region is controlled by India, and then the other 1/3 is controlled by Pakistan. In terms of international recognition, I'd say it also varies by countries. I don't actually know what the United Nations formally recognizes. On most matters like this, they're sort of toothless, but I think the general consensus is that these are like the unofficial, official borders, if that makes sense. Any other questions? All right, cool. So we'll move on past that then. So going back to the Kashmir question. So under the partition plan provided by the Indian Independence Act, Kashmir was free to either accede to India or Pakistan. So actually originally what happened was that Hari Singh wanted Kashmir to become independent, wanted to become its own different country, right? But in 1847, he was forced to join India almost because they agreed to help out against its invasion of tribesmen from Pakistan. Since then, opinion really hasn't changed because I guess people want to stay independent. But since then, people really still want to remain independent. Keep in mind this poll is from 2007, but 90% of citizens in the Kashmir region want independence from both India and Pakistan, and they want to form their own country. And so I guess that's just really another interesting factor to consider in this entire question of Kashmir. It's not only a question of is this India's land or Pakistan's land, but maybe even a question of is this just land for Kashmir and their own little place? So continuing on with this Kashmir question, Pakistan wasn't pleased that Kashmir chose to join India, and accordingly, the first of 3 Indian-Pakistani wars broke out in 1947. The United Nations, which was newly formed at the time, keep in mind the United Nations came out of World War II, which had very recently ended. And so the United Nations was tasked with mediating this conflict. At the same time, they were also trying to juggle with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was also, I guess, in its infancy after World War II. The United Nations recommended that the 2 sides hold this referendum, deciding where Kashmir should remain, but the 2 sides could never demilitarize the region, and so the plebiscite never actually happened. Instead, the 2 countries agreed to draw a ceasefire line, which ended the war. Indian losses in the war totaled 1,104 killed and 3,000 wounded. Pakistan had about 6,000 killed and 14,000 wounded. India gained control of about 2/3 of Kashmir, and Pakistan the remaining 1/3. So really, since 1947, the borders of Kashmir haven't changed all that drastically. We're going to skip over the second war because, high key, it's irrelevant. Casualty-wise, there were a lot less deaths, I believe like about 100 on both sides. There were no big territorial changes. In 1965, there was the second war we talked about, or that was the third war, my bad, and a couple thousand died on both sides. We talked about before how there was this West Pakistan and East Pakistan. So East Pakistan became the new nation of Bangladesh. So if you know where Bangladesh is on the map, slightly up and to the right of India, that used to be part of Pakistan. And this war lasted 13 days and was a decisive victory for India. The point being this: well, Kashmir is this hot region between two nuclear rivals. There are a lot of other potential places for conflict to erupt. And so East Pakistan is very far away from West Pakistan, and yet despite that, we also saw a massive war break out there as well. So lots of different areas for things to take a turn for the worse. And speaking of nuclear weapons, we have to talk about the Kargil conflict. In the spring of 1999, the Pakistani army crossed that line of control we talked about. So this thing, that's the line of control, right? So Pakistan's army started to cross into Indian territory. And they seized some really strategically important posts in the Kargil district of Indian-controlled Kashmir. Sorry if I keep going back to the map. It doesn't say where Kargil is, but I believe it's closer toward like the mountain range. At any rate, right? Keep in mind that India had abandoned the mountain-ridden posts for the winter, and they had to move quickly to retake the territory. That ensuing standoff became known as the Kargil conflict. Officially, this isn't a war, and that's why it's dubbed the Kargil conflict for a reason, but unofficially, lots of people still died. On July 4th, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, who doesn't hold responsibility, like this was a move made independent of him, but was also pretty useless in de-escalating the crisis, flew to the United States to meet with Bill Clinton. The United States also wanted an agreement because they'd been notified that Pakistan planned to mobilize its nuclear weapons. And so, yeah, Pakistan planned to move its nuclear weapons. Things were about to take a turn for the worse. And so appropriately, the United Nations, the US National Security Advisor to Bill Clinton, Sandy Berger, told Clinton that this was the most important foreign policy meeting he'd ever endure, right? This really huge and existential question at the heart of this conflict. And so Clinton, he had this very difficult task. He had to balance a strong response while not giving Pakistan such a horrible deal that it would make Sharif in exile within his own country, right? Sharif has to come back from Washington, D.C. with something presentable to the military elites of his country. Otherwise, since he was already fearing his life, and that's why he brought his wife and kids to the D.C., he would definitely be in exile, and he would have no actual political power. War very well could have broken out. So Clinton recognized the existential threat of the situation, and he also recognized that he needed that strong response, because if he enabled Pakistan's territorial accession, that could risk nuclear entanglement from India. So now you get two nuclear powers involved with one another, and who knows, maybe China could take advantage of the chaos, toss themselves into the ring, and soon you got three nuclear powers, plus the United States who's trying to mediate the conflict, and maybe, even some other international actors like Russia trying to step in, and then you have 5 nuclear powers all in this one very tightly packed region. So pretty scary situation. And so what the United States said was, hey, we're going to threaten to cut a much needed IMF loan package to Pakistan and use that as leverage to get a good deal. And so it did work. Pakistan eventually agreed that they were going to draw down, and in return, Clinton promised to review the Lahore process, which would permanently resolve the India-Pakistan border dispute. So we didn't actually really get, Pakistani's leader didn't really get much from it, but it was more of a symbolic thing that he could bring home to the Pakistani people. Point being this, the crisis was averted, but it was too close for comfort. This was in 1999, literally about 20 years ago. So I guess it's a pretty scary thing to think about. Any questions about that? Either of the 3 wars or then this conflict in Kargil? All right, awesome. So now we go to the modern day. So Kashmir has a special position within India, thanks to Article 370. Now, that's this clause in the Constitution which gives Kashmir significant autonomy, including its own constitution, a separate flag, and independence over all matters except foreign affairs, defense, and communications. And it was really integral to keeping Kashmir part of India and not having them just become their own little independent state. The problem was that on August 5th of 2019, the BJP, which is India's ruling party and sometimes called Hindu nationalist by a lot of international observers, revoked that status. And so Article 370 didn't really apply to Kashmir. Then in the days following and in the days before, telephone networks and the internet were cut off in the region, before the presidential order was even announced. So a lot of people were really confused what the heck was happening. Public gatherings were banned, and tens of thousands of troops were sent in. Tourists were told to leave Kashmir under warnings of a terrorist threat. So yeah, pretty scary situation. Like this very independent part of India was slowly losing its independence. And not only that, there was very poor communication and tens of thousands of troops. I really just want to emphasize that were like sent to this region, almost militarizing it even more. So justifiably, this angered Pakistan, who viewed it as a threat to Kashmir's sovereignty and religiously motivated. After all, Kashmir is the only Muslim majority state in India, which is part of the reason why Pakistan says Kashmir ought to belong to them rather than India. India, meanwhile, says, look what Hari Singh said. He acceded to India, not you guys. But since then, we've seen a lot of hostile military standoffs. You know, back in August, there was like this situation where the two sides used armed strikes for the first time in quite a while on both sides. And then just last weekend, not this weekend, but last weekend, we saw the ceasefire violation that injured 5 civilians. So yeah, clearly the Kashmir conflict and situation hasn't resolved since then. Any questions about Kashmir? So I think that's the most important part of this entire discussion. Okay, cool. Some other important facts to consider. So the first is called the Citizenship Amendment Bill, otherwise referred to as CAB. This is a bill that grants citizenship status and recognizes religious persecution for all people except religious persecution against Muslims. So let's say you are an undocumented resident living in India. Hypothetically, you could naturalize into the country using some sort of religious persecution exemption, except if you're Muslim. And so people view that as clearly religiously motivated. And what's happened is a lot of people have been rounded up, including 2 million Muslims in this place called Assam alone. So they're being sent to like these detention camps, and a lot of people are just really scared for their life. And then there's also the Taliban factor. Pakistan has housed the Taliban in the past, including being the place where Osama bin Laden's mission was finally carried out when the United States SEAL Team 6 entered into Pakistan. And so Pakistan's been accused by the United States and India of really housing the Taliban and being really receptive to them. Pakistan obviously denies these allegations, but that's something to consider. Why might Pakistan be an important place for the Taliban to operate in, knowing where the Taliban also operates?
It's right next to Afghanistan?
Yeah, exactly. It's right next to Afghanistan, and so it offers Pakistan, or it offers the Taliban, this perfect opportunity to use like Pakistan as like this sort of bridge. And so they'll station a lot of their troops there as well. I think our next section. Oh, okay. So we've been talking about India and Pakistan this entire time, and they're not the only ones involved. So there's this place called Ladakh, and it's this disputed Himalayan border area within Kashmir. And that's a typo in the introduction. I really mean China in India too. So what happened was we saw the first border clash in over 45 years between India and China. Keep in mind, remember, China also has a little place here. Like this is the border claimed by India. This is the boundary claimed by China. And so you can see this very disputed territory in this entire little area. And then China also claims this boundary down here, if you can see. But at any rate, right? So this is the first border clash in 45 years. The last one was in 1962 when India got pretty handily defeated. It was a humiliating defeat for the country. And in the process, 20 Indian soldiers died. The thing was, there were no gunshots reported. Neither side had guns. So people were really baffled how they died. And according to like local reports, they were beaten to death with rocks and spiked clubs and all those different sorts of things. You may be wondering why we saw this border standoff. It's because India built a new road recently, an area that China claims it's its own. And so we saw a pretty quick and hostile standoff over that. So, okay, so this next session, we're just going to talk a lot about different solvency mechanisms and ways that we can draw down this crisis. But before we get to some of the solutions I looked into, think about this logically. What are different ways that India and Pakistan could avert some sort of crisis? And what are specific ways that India and China can avert some sort of crisis?
It's almost like India should restore some of the autonomy that they used to give to Kashmir so it wouldn't anger Pakistan as much.
Yeah, definitely. So like restoring Article 370, that could be something, giving Kashmir some of its independence, and in the process also, I guess, pleasing Pakistan. What other things could they do? Either side. Well, I'll give you a hint. It starts with D and ends in Y. It rhymes with diplomacy.
Yeah,
Anyone? Yeah, exactly. Diplomacy. So that's another important thing, right? Having talks and opening up frequent channels of communication. That's important to preventing any sort of crisis. We saw that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the way that JFK was able to avert the situation was because he had a hotline with Mikhail Gorbachev. And so that sort of stuff is really important. Or I don't know if it was Gorbachev. It was someone. All those Russian leaders sound the same to me. But yeah, definitely that's another method. And let's get one more idea. Maybe let's focus on China and India. How can they stop their crisis? Anyone? All right, no worries. We'll talk about some of those frameworks, but yeah. One more thing about Ladakh, it's, yes, China and India are focusing on this, but this also does present an opportunity for maybe Pakistan to take advantage of the chaos and use it to maybe further push their borders. So that's another thing to consider. You may draw an extemp question like, how will Pakistan, or how should Pakistan take advantage of the border disputes between India and China, or like how will they, right? So there are also different questions about that. Now, in terms of the specific research that I did, I think it comes down to a couple of different things when it comes down to drawing down this conflict. So the key one is confidence building measures, and there are a lot of different things here. But honestly, for any sort of conflict, the very first point you could always have, or this could even be your thesis and you could have some specific examples, is confidence building measures. That includes a couple of different things. So number one, you can exchange military information. So including different types of weapon systems both sides have, different types of nuclear armaments they have, all sorts of things, and then also budgeting. This helps get both sides understand, I guess, the military strength of the other side, and I guess just have a better understanding of the strength of their supposed opponent, I guess you can say. But more than that, I think there's a symbolic importance of that. When you exchange military information, it's this message you're saying where you're like, hey, I really trust the other side with what is really important information about security. You could also require the interaction of defense officials and experts. So frequent communication, frequent meetings between the two. So, having Chinese defense officials meet with Indian defense officials, having Pakistani defense officials meet with Indian defense experts, all sorts of different things, right? But by having that frequent interaction, you have that diplomacy we talked about, which is really important in averting any sort of crisis and making sure that you can have frequent discussions and communications. So yeah, diplomacy, right? Another thing, communication measures including hotlines and cool lines. What are hotlines? Anyone know?
Aren't they like direct phones from like for two countries? For example, there was one in like China and another country meant to like enter like direct communication.
Exactly. So like when there's ever a crisis, it's like direct communication between the two, very quick. I don't know if North Korea and South Korea had one, but I know there was lots of talks of getting a hotline between the two. And this is really important in clarifying any sort of miscommunication. Like, for example, let's say the United States gets this alert that, oh, this nuclear weapon is coming from Russia. They only have a couple of minutes to respond before they have to like counteract the move with something else that's equally extreme. So having a hotline where you can just quickly get into contact, like a direct line of communication between the presidents or leaders of a country, is really important. And then what are cool lines? This one's a bit more tricky. You may have to Google it, but what do you guys think that one is?
Direct lines to spill the tea instead of worrying about nuclear war.
You're honestly sort of close. Let's see if anyone could find out a good definition. Or, yeah, let's see if anyone knows what cool lines are, I guess.
Is it like for times of like non-war, but to like work through political stuff?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like hotlines are when you have like the big crisis. Cool lines are when you can like regularly relay information. Just be like, oh, yo, here's this heads up. So during moments when it's not exactly like a crisis facing you right in the face. There are also notification measures. So that includes notifying the other side about military drills. Let's say India decides to conduct some drills in the Himalayan. Let's say India decides to conduct some drills in Kashmir, like some military drills. Notifying Pakistan would probably be appreciated by the country and vice versa. And this applies beyond just India, Pakistan. These notification measures are really important elsewhere. Let's say China is conducting some military drills in the South China Sea. Clarifying that those are military drills and notifying the other side is really important. Otherwise, people can think that that's just like a military like march or something like that. You also have inspection measures. So in this case, for example, observing nuclear facilities, seeing if the other side is trying to secretly develop nuclear weapons, that requires a lot of trust. And it's not only like observing nuclear facilities, it could be also observing other military facilities. But just those sort of inspection measures to see like, here, you relay this information to me, right? If you look at this first point, you exchange all of this important military information, including stuff about weapon systems and budgeting. But now I really want to check that. So that's what inspection measures could do. They could help out with that. There's also banning certain technologies. Look, both sides will agree we are not going to use X weapon. So in a case like that, that could be, a nuclear agreement. So maybe both sides draw down the total amount of nuclear weapons they have, some sort of nuclear agreement like the United States and the Soviet Union used to have, before finally potentially, completely agreeing that they will never use nuclear weapons. And so having that would be another really important measure that both sides can take. Because like, at least that way, if a conflict does happen, it's not going to be like the 1999 Kargil conflict where we were this close to a nuclear war. And then there are activity and deployment constraint measures. That's just like, constraining, the urge to like just send a ton of troops out there and just constraining these sort of activities that a military might otherwise do. One more that I didn't add, but I think would be helpful, is clarifying both sides' red lines. So anyone know what a red line is?
I think it's like when one side in a conflict decides that they're going to say that like another group can't do this, and if they do that particular thing, they will like retaliate somehow.
Exactly. Yeah. So clarifying those red lines. What specific actions can India take that will provoke a nuclear response from Pakistan? What specific actions can Pakistan take that will provoke a nuclear response from India? And the same thing with China, understanding that. So clarifying those red lines and having a very clear nuclear posture review would be really beneficial. But beyond that, also explaining what might lead to military retaliation. So maybe not as extreme as nuclear retaliation, but military retaliation. And having that can make sure that the other side doesn't pass those red lines and inadvertently escalate a sort of conflict. So definitely there are countless measures when it comes to confidence building measures that can prevent like a total nuclear catastrophe/war. The next thing is international negotiations. Let's say India and Pakistan were to negotiate. Who do you think could help facilitate that process? In terms of
Maybe an international organization like the UN.
Exactly, yeah. So the United Nations in the past has actually been really integral in brokering peace agreements and helping facilitate deals. I think that they helped create one in Somalia, if I recall correctly, and also Libya, although that one's falling a bit apart, where they helped like create this UN-backed government. But that's not the point. The point is this. The UN, yes, it's called this toothless organization all the time, but it does have some very real powers. And that includes the ability to have this forum where both sides can come to the negotiating table and discuss these issues meaningfully in front of an organization they both trust. And so the United Nations could help to facilitate these international negotiations beyond confidence building measures, talking about what might be needed to fully demilitarize from the region. So there's international negotiations. There's also economic cooperation. generally speaking, the more economically integrated two countries are, the more they economically cooperate, the less likely they are to go to war. I don't know if any of you attended my economics lecture, but we talked about capitalist peace theory and then a more silly extension of it, the golden arches theory. But it basically states that when you have economic interconnectivity between two nations, they're very economically reliant on each other then, right? Pretty intuitive. And so they're less likely to go to war because war would mean economic devastation. And so by facilitating economic cooperation, maybe building railroads that go from India to Pakistan across Kashmir, those can be great measures to signal goodwill and even potentially facilitate greater economic cooperation and perhaps prevent any sort of conflict. And then, if needed, you can approach things with a more harsh approach. So economic isolation. Let's say that, for example, let's go back to the 1999 Kargil incident. You had Bill Clinton. He threatened to withdraw the IMF's bailout package, which was really needed for Pakistan, unless they started to withdraw from the Indian-controlled outposts in Kargil, and they did. So economic isolation, that stick approach in the carrot and stick model, can be very effective. It can also be things like international sanctions and whatnot. Or if you're President Trump, I guess, if you want, leveraging tariffs into a political tool. There's also revoking visas, not as strong of a message, but as needed. It can be an important symbolic thing like, hey, we are revoking the visas of Chinese officials in India, certain Chinese officials, until they draw back down from Ladakh, for example. And then the really bad scenario is sending the military, having some sort of deterrence framework where it's like, you attack us, we'll attack you. We're just showing this to show that we're not playing games. But those are the different sort of solutions that both sides can take. Are there any questions about that? Cool. Does anyone have their own little creative solutions that they think could work? Let's put on those brain caps and let's think about things logically.
So just a question. So in the event of nuclear conflict, wouldn't there be mutually assured destruction anyway? So how would building economic cooperation stop them from going to war?
Right. So that's, I guess what you're saying is mutually assured destruction is more of a reactive measure, I guess. Economic cooperation is more of a preventative one. It's like, hey, we prevent nuclear war from happening in the first place, right? We prevent the conflicts that may eventually escalate into nuclear war from happening in the first place. So there would have been no Kargil war that may have inadvertently escalated into nuclear war. The other thing too is this doctrine of mutually assured destruction, right? I guess that goes back to the thing we talked about with clarifying red lines. That's why it's all the more important. Because look, you need to clarify both countries' red lines to understand what might provoke a nuclear retaliation. Otherwise, you're going to have nuclear bombs going both ways, which will be kaboomy boom. And as we talked about, 2 billion people alone could die between India and Pakistan in the nuclear fallout from that war alone. But then the other thing too, I guess, is just answering your point more. I think there's the doctrine of mutually assured destruction has been falling apart. And let's say, I guess, if anything, yeah, I think mutually assured destruction just makes those confidence building measures all the more important. And I think economic cooperation, while it may not be able to address something like mutually assured destruction, it would prevent conflict from escalating to the point where they need to use nuclear weapons in the first place. Does that make sense? I sort of rambled there for a bit, but I think I answered your question.
So you're saying economic cooperation doesn't, in the event if they were going to go to nuclear war, it wouldn't really do anything, but it would stop them from getting to the point of going to nuclear war.
When you get to something like nuclear war, that's where important things like hotlines come into play, right? And ideally, you want to prevent stuff like nuclear war, which goes to these points like inspection measures, like observing nuclear facilities, banning certain technologies. So having a nuclear agreement where slowly but surely you draw down nuclear weapons, eventually get rid of them. And then also, one more thing, if you ever escalate to a nuclear crisis, would probably be just clarifying the red lines, what might provoke a nuclear retaliation, right? But other than that, when you're getting to the point where both sides are willing to use nuclear weapons, really the only solution at that point is hotlines. Ideally, you just want to prevent things from getting that bad, though. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right, cool. Looks like Steve is there. Steve, do you have anything to add? You there, Steve?
Yeah, I was muted the entire time, but no, I think that's good. Like, are there no other questions?
Yeah, I think there are. Oh,
What was the simulation you mentioned that said 2 billion would die in the event of nuclear war?
I don't remember where I got that. Was honestly something I was like researching for debate, and I was like sort of like an off the cuff sort of thing.
What
But
did you say?
what was that simulation about 2 billion people dying? But think
Oh.
about nuclear war this way. First off, the nuclear war itself between India and Pakistan, you're talking about over 1.5 billion people between those two countries alone. But then there's also the nuclear fallout, the environmental impacts. What does that mean for agricultural output? What does that mean for nuclear radiation? So all those other inadvertent effects that people may not immediately think about that also play a role in nuclear war. And altogether, that means about 2 billion people, many of whom aren't even living in India or Pakistan, could die from this. And so it doesn't look like we have any other questions, but did you end up having anything to add, Steve?
Nope.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna